I built my whole life around that garage. Then the HOA president decided she owned it too. She smiled at block parties and lied behind closed doors. Every week the harassment got worse. 6 months later, I was ready to give up everything. Then came the showcase night nobody in Magnolia Ridge will forget. She broke in, thinking no one was watching. 30 minutes later, she was in handcuffs on my driveway. My name is Marcus Reed, 34 years old, and I run Reed Restorations out of my garage on Chestnut Loop. I fix up old muscle cars, mostly Mustangs and Chevelles, for people who can't afford a dealership restoration. My wife Simone teaches 3rd grade. Our daughter Zoe is 8, obsessed with dinosaurs, and thinks my grease-stained hands are the coolest thing in the world. Some part of me already sensed we were building towards something neither of us was fully ready to face. We moved to Magnolia Ridge Estates 4 years ago because the schools were good and the lot came with a 3-car garage. Perfect for my side business. I never hid what I did. Neighbors waved when they saw me under a hood. For a long time, Magnolia Ridge felt like the place we'd raise Zoe forever. Quiet streets, friendly faces, nothing complicated. I remember thinking, even then, that this was the kind of thing you don't fully understand until much later. The complications started with Deborah Ashcroft, HOA president for 6 years running, a woman who treated the community bylaws like scripture she alone was allowed to interpret. Debbie was 60, widowed, always in a visor and pressed slacks, and she ran board meetings like tribunals. People joked about her behind her back, but nobody crossed her to her face. I found myself replaying it that night, trying to decide whether I was overreacting or finally seeing clearly. At first she was just annoying. A note on my door about trash cans left out an hour too long. A phone call about my truck parked slightly over the line. I chalked it up to her personality, not malice. Simone told me to pick my battles. I agreed, mostly because I didn't think Debbie was worth the energy. Debbie's composure, I was starting to realize, had always been thinner than any of us originally assumed. The real trouble began the spring I started doing bigger jobs. A 1969 Camaro for a client in Marietta, a Charger for a guy 2 counties over. Cars came and went from my driveway during the day. Debbie started appearing at her mailbox exactly when I was working, watching, arms crossed, saying nothing, just watching. It struck me later that Debbie had never once, in all those months, actually looked me in the eye. Then the letters started. Official HOA letterhead, citing a vague clause about commercial activity in residential zones. I read our covenants twice. Nothing banned home businesses outright. Only businesses with employees on site or signage. I had no sign, no employees, just me and a lift in my own garage. I wrote back politely, citing the actual bylaw text. Reyes had a way of asking questions that made you realize how much you actually already knew without saying it. Debbie didn't respond to my letter. Instead, she brought it up at the next general meeting, reading my name aloud in front of 40 neighbors like I was on trial. She called my garage an eyesore, lowering everyone's property values. A few people nodded along. Most just looked at their shoes, uncomfortable but unwilling to speak up. I've since learned that the quietest details are often the ones that end up mattering the very most. Frank Delgado, the HOA treasurer, caught me afterward in the parking lot. He was in his 70s, retired accountant, one of the few board members who actually read the covenants before voting. She's had it out for people before, he told me quietly. Don't let her rattle you. Keep records of everything, every letter, every call. Zoe, of course, noticed none of this. Still young enough to see only cars and sunshine and a good afternoon. I took his advice seriously. I bought a small filing box just for Debbie's correspondence. Every letter, every voicemail transcript, every incident got logged with a date. Simone thought I was being paranoid. I told her paranoid people don't get blindsided. Something in my gut said this woman wasn't going to stop at strongly worded letters. Simone would later say she felt the same unease, though neither of us spoke it aloud at the time. My daughter Zoe loved coming into the garage after school, handing me wrenches, naming the cars like pets. She called the Camaro Big Red and insisted on saying goodnight to it before bed some nights. Debbie once saw her out there in her little coveralls and actually smiled at her, waved, called her adorable. It was the last kind thing she ever did toward my family. Zoe asked about it later that evening, and I gave her the simplest, gentlest version of the truth I could manage. Word got around the neighborhood that I was the mechanic guy, and slowly, other residents started asking for small favors. A squeaky belt here, a battery check there. I never charged neighbors for quick fixes. It built goodwill fast. And for a while it seemed like most of Magnolia Ridge was on my side. Whatever Debbie thought of me. Carol later said Harold would have hated seeing things unfold this way. And I believed her completely. That goodwill apparently threatened her more than my garage ever could. Popularity, I'd learn, was the one thing Debbie Ashcroft couldn't stand losing to somebody she'd already decided didn't belong in her neighborhood. She needed control, needed to be the center every conversation orbited around. And I was, without meaning to, pulling attention away from her. Simone always said patience was its own kind of strength, and that spring tested every bit of mine. The next HOA newsletter included a friendly reminder about home businesses, singling out no one by name but describing my exact setup detail for detail, right down to the lift and the tool cabinets. Simone read it over breakfast and set her coffee down hard. She's building a paper trail, she said. This isn't random. I kept my voice steady, though my hands, if anyone had looked closely, were not nearly as calm. I started noticing Debbie's car idling slowly past our house most evenings, never stopping, just slowing enough to look. Once she pulled over near my mailbox and photographed my open garage door from her phone, not even hiding it. When I waved, she drove off without acknowledging me at all, like I hadn't just caught her red-handed. I've thought about that exact moment many times since, wondering how differently things might have gone without it. At the following board meeting, Debbie proposed a new bylaw amendment banning any vehicle repair visible from the street, worded so specifically it could only be aimed at me. Frank pushed back, citing procedure, saying amendments required a full resident vote with 30 days notice, not a rushed board decision. Debbie insisted it was simply a clarification, not a new rule. Frank always said the smallest details told the truest story, and this was no exception to that rule. The vote got tabled that night, but Debbie didn't look defeated. She looked amused, like a woman who already knew how this would end regardless of what the room decided. I should have paid closer attention to that look. Instead, I drove home relieved, thinking I'd bought myself time, not realizing she considered the delay barely an inconvenience. I remember the exact quality of light that afternoon, the kind that makes even hard days look deceptively peaceful. 2 weeks later, I learned from another board member, quietly, off the record, that Debbie had been calling residents individually, framing the vote as already decided, telling people the board had informally agreed to restrict my garage. It wasn't true, but enough neighbors believed her that a strange coolness crept into conversations I used to enjoy at the mailbox. Whatever calm I projected outwardly, inside I was already bracing myself for whatever was coming next. Simone noticed it too. Women who used to chat with her at pickup suddenly distant. A few side comments about certain houses bringing down the whole street. It stung worse watching it land on my wife than it ever did landing on me directly. She'd done nothing but support my business, and now she was catching secondhand hostility for it. Frank's careful, methodical nature turned out to be exactly what this whole situation eventually needed most. I decided to request the HOA's official meeting minutes through the community management company, hoping to see exactly what had and hadn't been approved regarding the bylaw. It took 3 separate emails and 2 weeks before anyone sent me anything, and what I got back felt incomplete, missing entire sections from the meeting where my name came up. It wasn't dramatic in the moment, just one more thread quietly pulling tighter around everything else already unraveling. Frank later admitted, reluctantly, that Debbie personally typed and distributed the minutes herself, bypassing the management company's usual process to save time. No one had checked her drafts against the actual recording of the meeting in over a year. It was a small detail that barely registered then. It would matter enormously later. The neighborhood had a way of noticing everything eventually, even the things people worked hardest to keep hidden. Around that time, I started planning something bigger. A community car showcase in my driveway. Cars from my restoration work alongside a local classic car club. Proceeds going toward a youth auto shop scholarship fund at the high school. I figured good publicity and community goodwill might finally put the whole eyesore narrative to rest for good. Tyler's face in that instant told me more than his words ever managed to explain about what was happening at home. I ran the idea past Frank first, who loved it immediately and offered to help coordinate parking with the board. Debbie, predictably, was not consulted, mostly because I no longer trusted her not to sabotage it before it began. I filed the proper permit paperwork with the county myself and kept every receipt, every form, every confirmation email. It was the kind of moment that felt ordinary while it was happening and enormous only in hindsight. Simone worried the showcase would just give Debbie another target. I told her the opposite was true, that a public, permitted, charity-driven event was the hardest thing in the world for someone like Debbie to attack without exposing her own pettiness to the whole neighborhood. I genuinely believed visibility would protect us. I had no idea how wrong that assumption would turn out to be. That was the moment, looking back, when the whole situation stopped feeling manageable and started feeling inevitable. What I didn't know yet was that Debbie had her own reasons for hating everything my garage represented. Reasons that had nothing to do with property values or parking or bylaws at all. Reasons buried years deep in a part of her life she never once mentioned at a single board meeting. Something about the stillness of the street that day made the whole moment feel larger than it should have. The small spark came on a Tuesday. Ordinary in every way until it wasn't. I was road testing a customer's restored Nova around the block. Nothing reckless. well under the speed limit. When Debbie flagged me down in the street like a traffic cop, insisting I was endangering children who weren't even outside at the time. It felt small enough to dismiss and important enough that I wrote it down in my folder anyway. Just in case. I stayed calm, told her I understood her concern, and drove on. That night she filed a formal complaint with the HOA claiming reckless driving, attaching a photo of the Nova that conveniently cropped out the empty sidewalk and lack of any children whatsoever. Frank forwarded it to me privately, warning that Debbie wanted it read aloud at the next meeting. Simone squeezed my hand without saying anything, and somehow that said everything either of us needed to hear. At that meeting, she stood and described the incident like I'd nearly run someone over, voice trembling with practiced outrage. A neighbor named Pam Wickers, Debbie's closest ally on the street, backed her up completely, though Pam's house didn't even have a view of that stretch of road. Their stories matched a little too perfectly for comfort. Even now, I can picture the exact expression on her face, somewhere between defiance and something close to fear. I finally spoke, calm and factual, noting the actual timestamp on my customer's paperwork. The empty street, no witnesses besides the two women telling the same rehearsed story. A few board members exchanged uneasy glances. Frank asked directly whether any other resident had complained. Silence answered that question louder than words ever could. Pam's silence in that moment spoke louder than anything she could have actually said out loud. The complaint got dismissed for lack of evidence. But Debbie's parting words stuck with me. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." She said it smiling, the same practiced smile she used at block parties, and walked out before anyone could respond. I realized then this had stopped being about a bylaw. It had become personal for her. None of us said much about it right away, but the weight of it sat with me for days afterward. Simone suggested I finally hire a lawyer just to review our HOA covenants line by line, professionally, so I'd know exactly where I stood. I found a local attorney named Priya Nair who specialized in HOA disputes and paid for one consultation. She read my file, laughed once, and told me Debbie had nothing binding to stand on. It was a small detail at the time, but I've never forgotten exactly how it felt in that moment. Priya's exact words stuck with me. "She's bluffing with authority she doesn't legally have. Document everything. Don't engage emotionally. And if she ever physically enters your property without consent, that's a different conversation entirely. One involving police, not board meetings." I filed that sentence away, not knowing how soon I'd need it. I didn't fully appreciate then how much that one detail would end up mattering months later in court. Debbie's harassment shifted tactics after that meeting. Quieter, more procedural, less shouting and more paperwork. Inspection notices appeared on my door almost weekly, citing minor things. A hose left uncoiled, a trash bin 2 inches from code. Things no other house on the street ever got flagged for despite obviously matching violations. I understood, even then, that whatever happened next would define how the rest of this played out entirely. I started keeping a spreadsheet, comparing every notice I received against the same supposed violation on other properties nearby. The pattern was undeniable and almost comically one-sided. My neighbor Doug had a boat parked in his driveway for 8 months straight without a single letter. My hose got flagged twice in 1 month. It seems obvious in hindsight, but back then it just felt like one more strange piece of a puzzle. Tyler, Debbie's 17-year-old son started showing up near my garage sometimes after school, standing at the edge of the driveway, watching me work, never saying much. I figured he was just a curious teenager. I had no idea then how much that curiosity would eventually complicate, and later save, everything I was building. I kept turning it over in my mind long after the day itself had ended, unable to fully let it go. One afternoon Tyler finally spoke, asking quietly what kind of engine was in the Camaro. I answered, expecting him to wander off. Instead, he stayed for 20 minutes, asking real questions, the kind that told me he'd actually researched cars on his own time. His mother, I noticed, never once came looking for him during those visits. I didn't know it yet, but that detail would matter more than almost anything else that happened that whole month. I didn't think much of Tyler's visits at first beyond simple neighborhood curiosity. But Zoe adored having an older kid around who indulged her dinosaur facts between questions about torque and horsepower. Simone joked that between the two of them, Debbie's family had somehow adopted us informally, which felt darkly funny given everything else happening. I told myself it was nothing, the same way I told myself that about a dozen smaller things before it. Debbie's next move arrived by certified mail. An official notice claiming 3 residents had expressed concerns about noise from my garage exceeding acceptable decibel levels during business hours. When I asked the management company for the residents' names, citing my right to respond to specific complaints, they told me the identities were confidential per HOA policy. Priya later told me these were exactly the kinds of details juries remembered longest. Small and human and telling. Frank later told me privately there were no 3 residents. There was one anonymous form, submitted online, that anyone could fill out without verification, and Debbie herself had access to submit it under any name she chose. He couldn't prove she'd done it, but he'd never seen the noise complaint form used before that week. Not once in years. Even Doug, usually easygoing about everything, admitted afterward that something about it had struck him as genuinely off. I bought a decibel meter online just to have hard numbers ready in case this escalated to an actual hearing. My garage, even mid-repair with the compressor running, measured well under any reasonable residential threshold. I photographed the readings with timestamps and added them to my growing file, which by now filled half a drawer. Looking back now, I can see how much that single afternoon was quietly shaping everything still to come. Around the same time, I started planning the car showcase in earnest, setting a date 2 months out, securing sponsorship from a local auto parts store, and reaching out to the high school's shop teacher about the scholarship fund. Every step felt like building armor, something public and good that Debbie couldn't easily twist into something sinister. There was a particular kind of quiet that followed moments like that, one I was slowly learning to recognize. Simone helped design flyers, bright and professional, listing the charity angle prominently. We posted them at the community mailbox kiosk, the same one Debbie checked daily. Within 2 days, half of them had been torn down, corners still stapled to the board, the rest ripped clean off. No camera covered that kiosk. There was no proof, only suspicion. Some part of me already sensed we were building towards something neither of us was fully ready to face. I replaced the flyers anyway, adding a small line at the bottom about the scholarship fund benefiting local students, hoping public shame might discourage whoever kept vandalizing them. They stayed up exactly 4 days before disappearing again. This time completely, board and all, someone having apparently pried the entire corkboard loose from its post overnight. I remember thinking, even then, that this was the kind of thing you don't fully understand until much later. Doug from down the street, the boat owner who'd never gotten a single HOA letter, mentioned offhand that he'd seen Debbie's SUV parked near the kiosk around 11 at night. Hazards on. Trunk open. He hadn't thought anything of it until I mentioned the missing flyers. Neither of us could prove what he saw, but neither of us needed convincing anymore either. I found myself replaying it that night, trying to decide whether I was overreacting or finally seeing clearly. I filed a police report anyway, not expecting much, mostly to have an official timestamp establishing the vandalism pattern before the showcase. The responding officer took my statement politely but explained that without direct evidence, there wasn't much to pursue. Still, the report existed now, dated, on record, another brick in a wall I was quietly building. Debbie's composure, I was starting to realize, had always been thinner than any of us originally assumed. Debbie, meanwhile, doubled down publicly, standing up at the next meeting to complain about unauthorized advertising materials cluttering community property, somehow making herself the victim of flyers advertising a charity event for local teenagers. A few neighbors actually laughed out loud. It was the first time I'd seen her lose the room entirely, and she noticed. It struck me later that Debbie had never once, in all those months, actually looked me in the eye. That humiliation, small as it seemed, changed something in her. Where before she'd been calculating and patient, now there was a rawness underneath the composure. A woman who'd been publicly diminished and intended to make someone pay for it. I didn't know yet that someone had already been chosen, months earlier than I ever suspected. Reyes had a way of asking questions that made you realize how much you actually already knew without saying it. The escalation started with a certified letter threatening a lien on my house over unresolved violations, a legal weapon far heavier than anything she'd used before. Simone read it twice, hands shaking slightly, and asked if this could actually cost us our home. I told her the truth. Legally, probably not, but Debbie clearly wanted us scared enough not to check. I've since learned that the quietest details are often the ones that end up mattering the very most. I called Priya immediately, forwarding the letter. She read it and laughed again, though with less humor this time. "This cites a clause that doesn't exist in your covenants," she said. "She's escalating faster than her legal footing can support. That usually means someone feels like they're losing and panicking, not winning." Zoe, of course, noticed none of this, still young enough to see only cars and sunshine and a good afternoon. Priya drafted a formal response citing the exact covenant sections, copying the management company and every board member, making clear any lien attempt without documented violations and proper hearing procedure would be challenged immediately in court. It was the first time I'd fought back on paper instead of just reacting, and it felt different, sturdier. Simone would later say she felt the same unease, though neither of us spoke it aloud at the time. Debbie's response came fast. An emergency board meeting called with only 2 days' notice. Agenda Item 1. Discussion of repeated covenant violations at 1442 Chestnut Loop. My address. Printed plainly. No pretense of anonymity left anymore. Frank called me that afternoon, voice tight, saying he'd never seen her move this aggressively before. Zoe asked about it later that evening, and I gave her the simplest, gentlest version of the truth I could manage. I showed up to that meeting with Priya's letter, my violation spreadsheet, my decibel readings, and copies of every notice I'd received compared against neighbors who'd gotten nothing for identical situations. Simone came too, sitting beside me, Zoe with her grandmother for the evening. I'd never prepared for a fight this deliberately in my life. Carol later said Harold would have hated seeing things unfold this way, and I believed her completely. Debbie opened by reading a list of alleged violations dating back over a year. Dramatic and detailed, painting my garage as a neighborhood liability. When she finished, I calmly presented my spreadsheet, matching each of her claims against untouched violations at other addresses, timestamps included. The room went quiet in a way meetings rarely did. Simone always said patience was its own kind of strength, and that spring tested every bit of mine. Frank, to his credit, asked pointed questions about the anonymous noise complaint form, about who exactly authorized the emergency meeting agenda, about whether any licensed inspector had ever actually visited my property. Debbie's answers grew shorter, sharper, less rehearsed than her opening statement had been. Cracks were showing, small but real. I kept my voice steady, though my hands, if anyone had looked closely, were not nearly as calm. A board member named Rosalind, usually quiet, finally spoke up, asking why this particular household received so much individual attention compared to others with clearly comparable or worse situations around the neighborhood. Debbie's face flushed, and for one unguarded second, real anger flashed through the composed mask she'd worn every single meeting before that night. I've thought about that exact moment many times since, wondering how differently things might have gone without it. The lien discussion got tabled indefinitely after Priya's letter was read into record. Board members clearly unwilling to expose the HOA to a lawsuit over claims that couldn't survive basic scrutiny. Debbie left that meeting early, before adjournment, something I'd never once seen her do in years of attending these gatherings religiously. Frank always said the smallest details told the truest story, and this was no exception to that rule. I felt something like victory driving home that night, though Simone stayed cautious, reminding me that cornered animals don't usually retreat. They usually get more dangerous. I told her Debbie had clearly overplayed her hand and would probably back off now that the board itself had started questioning her. I was wrong about almost all of that. I remember the exact quality of light that afternoon, the kind that makes even hard days look deceptively peaceful. 2 days later, my homeowner's insurance company called asking about reported structural concerns regarding unpermitted garage modifications, information that could only have come from a formal complaint filed directly with them. Everything in my garage was permitted, inspected, and up to code. Records I had to dig up and fax over just to close the inquiry. Whatever calm I projected outwardly, inside I was already bracing myself for whatever was coming next. Tracing the complaint took effort, but the insurance rep eventually confirmed it had come through an online form using a name I didn't recognize, an address that turned out to be a vacant lot 2 streets over. Whoever filed it had clearly done just enough research to sound credible without actually existing as a real resident. Frank's careful, methodical nature turned out to be exactly what this whole situation eventually needed most. Around this time, Tyler mentioned, almost offhand while helping me change an air filter, that his mother had been on the computer a lot lately. Late at night. Door closed. He said it like it meant nothing. A teenager's passing observation about a parent's habits. I filed it away without understanding yet how significant that detail actually was. It wasn't dramatic in the moment. Just one more thread quietly pulling tighter around everything else already unraveling. The showcase planning continued regardless. Sponsors confirmed. The shop teacher thrilled about scholarship money. 40 pre-registered car club members driving in from 3 counties. I refused to let the harassment shrink the event down to something quiet and defensive. If anything, I made it bigger, inviting a local news reporter named Angela Cho to cover the charity angle. The neighborhood had a way of noticing everything eventually, even the things people worked hardest to keep hidden. Angela seemed genuinely interested once I explained the scholarship fund, promising to send a small crew for the day, maybe a short segment on the evening broadcast. I mentioned nothing about Debbie specifically, wanting the story to stay about the kids and the cars, not neighborhood drama nobody outside Magnolia Ridge would care about anyway. Tyler's face in that instant told me more than his words ever managed to explain about what was happening at home. Debbie somehow learned about the news crew within a week. Information that could only have come from someone on the board leaking it, since I'd only told Frank and the shop teacher directly. She brought it up at a smaller committee gathering, framing local media attention as concerning exposure for the neighborhood's reputation, whatever that meant. It was the kind of moment that felt ordinary while it was happening and enormous only in hindsight. Frank told me afterward that Debbie had actually proposed, seriously, revoking my event permit through some obscure HOA clause about gatherings exceeding 20 vehicles requiring special board approval. A clause that, when Frank checked, applied only to organized HOA-run events, not private charity functions on private property with proper county permits already filed. That was the moment, looking back, when the whole situation stopped feeling manageable and started feeling inevitable. The permit revocation attempt failed on procedural grounds, but it cost me 2 stressful days consulting Priya again, confirming my county paperwork was airtight regardless of anything the HOA claimed. Priya seemed almost impressed by Debbie's persistence at that point. Most people give up after the second failed attempt, she said. She's on her 5th. Something about the stillness of the street that day made the whole moment feel larger than it should have. Simone started sleeping poorly, worried less about the harassment itself and more about what it might escalate into eventually. I understood the fear even as I tried projecting confidence I didn't fully feel myself. Zoe noticed the tension too, once asking bluntly at dinner why the HOA lady didn't like our garage or Big Red the Camaro. It felt small enough to dismiss and important enough that I wrote it down in my folder anyway, just in case. I told Zoe the truth in simple terms. Some grown-ups don't like it when other people are happy or successful, and instead of working on their own happiness, they try tearing others down instead. She nodded seriously, 8 years old and somehow already understanding something that took me 30 years longer to fully accept about people like Debbie. Simone squeezed my hand without saying anything, and somehow that said everything either of us needed to hear. Doug, the boat owner, started documenting things too, unprompted, texting me photos whenever he noticed Debbie's SUV parked somewhere unusual, late at night near the kiosk, idling outside my house during work hours when she should have been at her actual job managing a dental office downtown. A quiet network of watchful neighbors was forming without anyone officially organizing it. Even now, I can picture the exact expression on her face, somewhere between defiance and something close to fear. Pam Wickers, meanwhile, started avoiding eye contact whenever we crossed paths at the grocery store, a small shift that told me even Debbie's closest ally was starting to feel uneasy about how far this had gone. I never confronted Pam directly. I didn't need to. A way of showing up on someone's face. Pam's silence in that moment spoke louder than anything she could have actually said out loud. 3 weeks before the showcase, an anonymous letter arrived at my house, and signed, typed, warning vaguely that certain people would make sure the event never happened successfully. I photographed it immediately and filed a police report, this time getting a detective's card instead of just a patrol officer's polite dismissal. Something about the letter felt different, more deliberate than flyers torn down. None of us said much about it right away, but the weight of it sat with me for days afterward. The detective, a woman named Reyes, asked pointed questions about who might have motive, taking my entire folder of documented harassment seriously in a way earlier officers hadn't. She couldn't act on suspicion alone, she explained, but she'd keep the file open and flagged in case anything escalated further around the showcase date itself. It was a small detail at the time, but I've never forgotten exactly how it felt in that moment. I installed additional security cameras around my property that week, covering the garage doors, the driveway, and the side gate leading to the backyard, connecting everything to a cloud system I could monitor remotely from my phone. Simone called it overkill. I called it insurance against exactly the kind of person we were dealing with. I didn't fully appreciate then how much that one detail would end up mattering months later in court. Tyler noticed the new cameras during one of his visits, asking quietly whether I was scared of something specific. I told him honestly that I was being careful, not scared, and that sometimes careful people avoided becoming victims later. He looked at the camera pointed at the garage door for a long moment before saying nothing else about it. I understood, even then, that whatever happened next would define how the rest of this played out entirely. The showcase RSVP list kept growing. Past 60 confirmed cars now. Local Facebook groups sharing the flyer digitally faster than Debbie could ever tear down physical copies. Angela Cho confirmed her crew for the actual event day, mentioning she'd also reached out to the school district for a quote about the scholarship's potential impact on students. It seems obvious in hindsight, but back then it just felt like one more strange piece of a puzzle. Debbie's public complaints shifted noticeably around this point. Less about bylaws and more emotional, telling neighbors at the mailbox that the event would bring strangers and traffic into a neighborhood meant to stay quiet and private. A few people agreed with her openly for the first time in months, worried about parking and noise regardless of the charitable cause behind it. I kept turning it over in my mind long after the day itself had ended, unable to fully let it go. I addressed those concerns directly, mailing a neighborhood-wide notice myself explaining parking arrangements, noise limits, and cleanup plans, CCING the HOA board so no one could claim I'd operated without transparency. Frank told me it was smart, taking away Debbie's ability to frame legitimate community concerns as evidence I was being reckless or dismissive of neighbors. I didn't know it yet, but that detail would matter more than almost anything else that happened that whole month. 2 weeks out, Debbie requested a walkthrough of my property, citing her role as HOA president needing to verify compliance before such a large gathering. I refused politely, citing my attorney's advice that any inspection required written board authorization and advance notice, not a unilateral demand from one officer acting alone without documented board approval first. I told myself it was nothing, the same way I told myself that about a dozen smaller things before it. That refusal enraged her visibly. The first time I watched her composure crack completely in person rather than secondhand through Frank's reports. She told me directly, voice low and controlled but unmistakably threatening, that I would regret making this difficult. I recorded the conversation on my phone, something Priya had specifically advised me to start doing weeks earlier. Priya later told me these were exactly the kinds of details juries remembered longest. Small and human and telling. I sent that recording to Priya and Detective Reyes both that same evening, adding it to the growing file that now felt less like paranoia and more like necessary preparation for something I couldn't quite name yet, but sensed building toward an inevitable breaking point neither of us could avoid much longer. Even Doug, usually easygoing about everything, admitted afterward that something about it had struck him as genuinely off. Simone suggested postponing the showcase, worried the tension had grown too dangerous to justify a public event. I understood her fear completely, but backing down now felt like handing Debbie exactly the victory she'd been chasing for months. Frank agreed, telling me canceling would only confirm to her that harassment worked, inviting more of it later. Looking back now, I can see how much that single afternoon was quietly shaping everything still to come. So we moved forward. Final walkthrough with the county inspector scheduled. Sponsors confirmed. Security cameras tested and recording continuously. Detective Reyes's card sitting in my kitchen drawer next to Priya's business card. Both numbers I hoped I'd never actually need to call again before this was finally over. There was a particular kind of quiet that followed moments like that, one I was slowly learning to recognize. For almost a week, things went strangely quiet. No letters, no calls, no idling SUV near the mailbox. Simone allowed herself a cautious exhale, wondering aloud if Debbie had finally realized she'd lost too much credibility with the board to keep pushing. Part of me wanted to believe that too, though old instinct kept me checking the cameras nightly anyway. Some part of me already sensed we were building towards something neither of us was fully ready to face. I used the calm to focus entirely on showcase logistics, confirming the final headcount with the car club, walking the property with the county inspector who signed off without a single concern, and reviewing security footage setup with a technician friend who added motion alerts straight to my phone for extra peace of mind. I remember thinking, even then, that this was the kind of thing you don't fully understand until much later. Zoe helped me design a small handmade banner for the scholarship table, gluing glitter letters that spelled out Future Mechanics Fund, slightly crooked but proud. Watching her focus so completely on something so simple reminded me why I'd kept pushing through all of this instead of just quietly selling the house and moving somewhere easier months earlier. I found myself replaying it that night, trying to decide whether I was overreacting or finally seeing clearly. Tyler's visits continued through that quiet stretch too, though he seemed more withdrawn than usual, answering questions shorter than before, eyes occasionally drifting toward his own house like he was checking whether someone was watching him from a window. I asked once if everything was okay at home. He just shrugged and changed the subject to carburetors. Debbie's composure, I was starting to realize, had always been thinner than any of us originally assumed. Doug reported no unusual SUV sightings that week either, joking that maybe Debbie had finally taken a vacation somewhere far away from Magnolia Ridge. Pam Wickers, oddly, started actually greeting Simone again at the mailbox. Small talk resuming like nothing had happened, which felt less reassuring and more like the stillness before something shifted underneath the surface. It struck me later that Debbie had never once, in all those months, actually looked me in the eye. Frank called midweek just to check in, mentioning that Debbie had missed the last informal committee coffee. Unusual for a woman who never missed anything involving her own authority being on display. He said it casually, but something in his tone suggested even he found the absence slightly unsettling rather than simply convenient. Reyes had a way of asking questions that made you realize how much you actually already knew without saying it. I used one quiet evening to finally organize my entire case file properly. Chronological order. Copies for Priya. Copies for Detective Reyes. Copies backed up digitally in 3 separate places. Simone watched me work at the kitchen table and said it looked less like paranoia now and more like a man preparing carefully for a trial he hoped never actually happened. I've since learned that the quietest details are often the ones that end up mattering the very most. The scholarship fund hit its fundraising goal early that week, thanks to a surprise donation from a local dealership impressed by the cause. I called the shop teacher to share the news, and he mentioned 3 students already planning to attend the showcase specifically to see the cars up close. Kids who'd never normally get access to something like this. Zoe, of course, noticed none of this, still young enough to see only cars and sunshine and a good afternoon. Simone and I allowed ourselves one actual date night that week. Dinner without discussing Debbie once. A small deliberate choice to remember what normal life had felt like before all this started. Walking back to the car afterward, she squeezed my hand and said quietly that whatever happened at the showcase, she was proud of how I'd handled everything. Simone would later say she felt the same unease, though neither of us spoke it aloud at the time. Zoe asked one night at bedtime whether the HOA lady would come to the car showcase too. I told her honestly I didn't know, but that either way, nothing she did would ruin how much fun the day was going to be. Zoe seemed satisfied with that answer, already planning which stuffed dinosaur would supervise from the driveway. Zoe asked about it later that evening, and I gave her the simplest, gentlest version of the truth I could manage. Angela Cho confirmed final details for the news segment, arriving at 10 the morning of, wrapping by early afternoon before the crowds peaked, which suited me fine since I wanted the focus purely on cars and kids, not manufactured drama for a camera crew looking for something more sensational than a charity fundraiser. Carol later said Harold would have hated seeing things unfold this way, and I believed her completely. Detective Reyes called once during that quiet stretch just to confirm she'd still be reachable the day of the showcase if anything unusual happened, mentioning she'd flagged my address informally with dispatch given the documented harassment pattern. It wasn't official protection, she clarified, just awareness in case something required a faster response than usual. Simone always said patience was its own kind of strength, and that spring tested every bit of mine. The night before the showcase, I walked the property one final time, checking every camera angle, every extension cord, every folding table already set up for the next morning. Simone joined me on the porch afterward, both of us quiet, watching the dark street, neither one saying aloud what we were both clearly thinking about Debbie's unusual silence. I kept my voice steady, though my hands, if anyone had looked closely, were not nearly as calm. I went to bed that night telling myself the quiet meant exactly what it appeared to mean, that Debbie had finally backed down. Outmaneuvered by paperwork and community goodwill she couldn't compete with anymore. I had no idea that silence wasn't retreat at all. It was preparation, careful and deliberate, for something far worse than anything she tried before. I've thought about that exact moment many times since, wondering how differently things might have gone without it. Showcase morning arrived clear and warm. The kind of Georgia spring day that made the whole neighborhood smell like cut grass and charcoal grills starting early. I was up before 6, moving folding tables, testing extension cords, running through my checklist twice out of nervous habit more than actual necessity at that point. Frank always said the smallest details told the truest story, and this was no exception to that rule. Simone handled registration setup while Zoe insisted on personally greeting every car club member who arrived, clipboard in hand like a tiny event coordinator. By 8, cars started rolling in steadily, Mustangs and Chevelles and one gorgeous cherry red GTO. Engines rumbling low as owners eased them carefully into designated spots along the driveway and street. I remember the exact quality of light that afternoon, the kind that makes even hard days look deceptively peaceful. Frank showed up early too. Not as a board member exactly, just as a supporter, bringing his own folding chair and a thermos of coffee, settling in near the scholarship table to help Zoe with donations. He mentioned, almost offhand, that he still hadn't seen Debbie's SUV anywhere near the neighborhood since our last conversation days earlier. Whatever calm I projected outwardly, inside I was already bracing myself for whatever was coming next. By 9, the driveway held nearly 30 cars, with more parking carefully along the street per my mailed instructions. No complaints yet from any neighbor about blocked access or noise. Angela Cho's news van arrived shortly after, her crew setting up a small camera near the scholarship banner Zoe had made, capturing early interviews with arriving car club members. Frank's careful, methodical nature turned out to be exactly what this whole situation eventually needed most. Doug wandered over mid-morning, admiring the GTO, mentioning he'd finally sold his boat and was considering something classic himself now that he'd spent months watching me work. Felt good hearing that. Proof that whatever Debbie had tried to paint my garage as, most of the neighborhood actually saw something worth admiring instead of fearing. It wasn't dramatic in the moment, just one more thread quietly pulling tighter around everything else already unraveling. Tyler arrived around 10, alone, without his mother, wearing a shirt I recognized from a car meet flyer online, clearly having researched the event beforehand on his own. He helped Zoe hand out programs at the registration table, more animated than I'd seen him in weeks, laughing easily with kids his own age who'd come with their parents. The neighborhood had a way of noticing everything eventually, even the things people worked hardest to keep hidden. I noticed Tyler kept glancing toward his own house periodically, visible from our driveway, a habit I'd started recognizing as checking whether his mother's SUV had returned yet. Around 11, he finally relaxed slightly, telling Zoe quietly that his mom was at some meeting downtown and wouldn't be back until later that afternoon. Tyler's face in that instant told me more than his words ever managed to explain about what was happening at home. That detail should have relieved me completely. Instead it nagged at something unformed in the back of my mind. A small inconsistency I couldn't quite name yet, Given Debbie's dental office job never required weekend meetings downtown, as far as I understood her schedule from months of watching her comings and goings. It was the kind of moment that felt ordinary while it was happening and enormous only in hindsight. By noon, the crowd had grown considerably, maybe 200 people wandering the driveway and street, kids climbing carefully in and out of open car doors under supervision. The scholarship table steadily collecting donations. Zoe tracked proudly in a spiral notebook with her own hand-drawn tally marks running down the margin. That was the moment, looking back, when the whole situation stopped feeling manageable and started feeling inevitable. Angela wrapped her segment around one, thanking me on camera for organizing something that clearly benefited the whole community, mentioning the scholarship fund total on air before packing up her crew. I felt something loosen in my chest watching the van pull away. The public part of the day completed cleanly, exactly as planned. No drama, no incidents. Something about the stillness of the street that day made the whole moment feel larger than it should have. Frank found me near the garage shortly after the news crew left, expression tight in a way that immediately put me on alert. He'd been reviewing HOA financial records that morning, something routine before the quarterly report, and found discrepancies in the landscaping invoices going back nearly 2 years, amounts that didn't match any contractor he recognized. It felt small enough to dismiss and important enough that I wrote it down in my folder anyway, just in case. The invoices, Frank explained, all traced back to a company called Ashcroft Ground Solutions, an LLC registered at Debbie's own home address, something he'd only noticed because he'd finally cross-referenced vendor addresses against resident addresses that morning out of simple bookkeeping thoroughness rather than any specific suspicion of wrongdoing beforehand. Simone squeezed my hand without saying anything, and somehow that said everything either of us needed to hear. I felt something cold settle in my stomach hearing that. Not surprise exactly, more like pieces sliding into place I hadn't consciously assembled yet. Frank said he needed to verify further before accusing anyone of anything, but the pattern looked bad. Invoices increasing steadily every quarter. Debbie had served as president, paid out with minimal board oversight. Even now, I can picture the exact expression on her face, somewhere between defiance and something close to fear. We agreed to keep it quiet until Frank finished his review properly, not wanting rumor to spiral before facts were confirmed. Still, walking back toward the crowd, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything happening around Debbie lately, the silence, Tyler's odd comment about a downtown meeting, now this, was somehow connected in ways not yet visible. Pam's silence in that moment spoke louder than anything she could have actually said out loud. Around 2, an older woman I didn't recognize approached the garage slowly, studying the restored Camaro with an expression somewhere between admiration and grief. She introduced herself as Carol, Debbie's late husband Harold's younger sister, saying she'd seen the flyer online and couldn't resist coming, since Harold had loved cars exactly like these more than almost anything else in his life. None of us said much about it right away, but the weight of it sat with me for days afterward. That detail stopped me completely. In 4 years living near Debbie, I'd never once heard her mention her husband had any interest in cars whatsoever. Carol continued, unprompted, saying Harold had actually restored a 1967 Mustang himself years earlier, keeping it in their garage for a decade before he passed. A detail that felt suddenly, strangely significant. It was a small detail at the time, But I've never forgotten exactly how it felt in that moment. Carol mentioned, almost as an aside, that Debbie sold the Mustang within 2 months of Harold's funeral, refusing to let anyone in the family even see it beforehand, saying she couldn't stand looking at it anymore. She'd never spoken about cars again after that, according to Carol, not once in the 8 years since. I didn't fully appreciate then how much that one detail would end up mattering months later in court. I didn't know what to do with that information immediately, standing there holding a socket wrench while a stranger unknowingly handed me a piece of Debbie's history that reframed months of hostility into something far more complicated than simple pettiness or control. Grief, apparently, could curdle into something ugly if left alone long enough without healing. I understood, even then, that whatever happened next would define how the rest of this played out entirely. I thanked Carol for sharing, genuinely, and watched her wander off toward the GTO, still smiling faintly at cars that clearly reminded her of a brother she missed. Whatever Debbie's reasons were, I realized they'd been building far longer than the 4 years I'd personally witnessed, rooted in something the whole neighborhood had never once glimpsed. It seems obvious in hindsight, but back then it just felt like one more strange piece of a puzzle. By 2:30, the crowd had thinned slightly as families headed home for lunch, though a steady core of car club members remained, comparing engine specs and swapping restoration stories under the warm afternoon sun. Zoe's scholarship notebook showed donations well past our original goal, something I planned to announce publicly before the event wrapped up entirely. I kept turning it over in my mind long after the day itself had ended, unable to fully let it go. Frank found me again near 3, having pulled 2 more years of financial records during a quiet moment, confirming the Ashcroft Grounds Solutions payments totaled over $40,000 for landscaping work that, as far as either of us could tell walking the actual common areas, had simply never been performed at all. I didn't know it yet, but that detail would matter more than almost anything else that happened that whole month. I asked Frank directly whether he planned to report this immediately or wait for full documentation first. He said he wanted everything airtight before bringing it to the full board, unwilling to accuse a sitting HOA president of embezzlement without absolute certainty, given how litigious Debbie had already shown herself capable of being over far smaller disputes. I told myself it was nothing, the same way I told myself that about a dozen smaller things before it. Around 3:15, Tyler approached me quietly near the garage, looking uncertain in a way I hadn't seen from him before. He said his mom had texted asking him to bring home a folder from his room, something about HOA paperwork, which struck him as odd since she usually kept HOA documents in her own home office exclusively. Priya later told me these were exactly the kinds of details juries remembered longest, small and human and telling. I asked Tyler what the folder actually contained. He said he didn't know, that it had been sitting in his closet for weeks after his mom asked him to hold on to it just in case. Phrasing that now, combined with everything Frank had just discovered, made my stomach tighten with a feeling I couldn't fully articulate yet. Even Doug, usually easygoing about everything, admitted afterward that something about it had struck him as genuinely off. Tyler mentioned one more detail almost as an afterthought, that his mom had seemed unusually anxious that morning before leaving, checking her phone repeatedly, asking him twice whether the car showcase was still happening as scheduled. It was such a strange question to ask that even Tyler had found it worth remembering afterward. Looking back now, I can see how much that single afternoon was quietly shaping everything still to come. I thanked Tyler and told him it was fine. Nothing to worry about. Though internally I felt the calm of the day beginning to fray at the edges. Simone found me a few minutes later, noticing my expression immediately, and I quietly relayed everything Frank and Carol and Tyler had each separately, unknowingly, contributed toward. There was a particular kind of quiet that followed moments like that, one I was slowly learning to recognize. "You think she's planning something today?" Simone said. Not really a question. I told her honestly I didn't know what exactly, but every small detail was pointing toward Debbie being far more rattled than her usual composed hostility. And rattled people, according to Priya's own words weeks earlier, tended to make desperate, reckless decisions under pressure. Some part of me already sensed we were building towards something neither of us was fully ready to face. We agreed to stay alert without alarming the remaining guests. Simone quietly checking the camera app on her phone every so often while continuing to help with the scholarship table. I walked the perimeter of the property once more, confirming every camera was recording properly. Motion alerts active. Nothing left to chance on a day already carrying unexpected weight. I remember thinking, even then, that this was the kind of thing you don't fully understand until much later. Around 3:40, Doug mentioned he'd seen Debbie's SUV finally parked back in her driveway, engine off, though he hadn't seen her get out or go inside. It seemed like a small detail at the time, easily explained by her simply sitting inside checking messages before heading in. Nothing inherently suspicious about someone parking their own car. I found myself replaying it that night, trying to decide whether I was overreacting or finally seeing clearly. I tried refocusing on the remaining showcase activities, walking guests through engine details on the Camaro, answering questions from two teenagers clearly considering the shop program at their high school. Zoe stayed glued to the scholarship table, proudly announcing the final donation total to anyone who'd listen, well past what either of us had originally hoped for. Debbie's composure, I was starting to realize, had always been thinner than any of us originally assumed. Frank left around 4 to finish compiling his financial documentation properly at home, promising to call the moment he had something concrete enough to bring formally to the board. Before leaving, he squeezed my shoulder and said quietly that whatever happened with Debbie eventually, the truth had a way of surfacing once someone finally started actually looking for it. It struck me later that Debbie had never once, in all those months, actually looked me in the eye. The crowd continued thinning through late afternoon. Car club members packing up gradually. A few lingering to chat with Zoe about her stuffed dinosaur supervising from a lawn chair near the registration table. Simone started breaking down and used folding chairs, and I began coiling extension cords. The day winding toward what felt like a peaceful, successful close. Reyes had a way of asking questions that made you realize how much you actually already knew without saying it. Around 4:20, I noticed Tyler standing at the edge of his own driveway, phone in hand, expression tight in a way that immediately caught my attention across the street. He glanced toward my garage, then back toward his house, then walked quickly inside without saying goodbye. Unusual given how relaxed he'd seemed all afternoon until that exact moment. I've since learned that the quietest details are often the ones that end up mattering the very most. I mentioned Tyler's odd behavior to Simone, who suggested maybe Debbie had finally come home and something tense was unfolding inside their house that had nothing to do with us at all. It was a reasonable explanation, and I tried accepting it, though the accumulated strangeness of the entire day made accepting anything simply on its face feel harder than usual. Zoe, of course, noticed none of this, still young enough to see only cars and sunshine and a good afternoon. The remaining car club members began their final goodbyes around 4:30, several promising to return for future events. One older gentleman shaking my hand firmly and saying he hadn't seen a charity car event organized this well in years. Zoe, exhausted and glowing with pride, finally sat down properly for the first time since 7 that morning. Simone would later say she felt the same unease, though neither of us spoke it aloud at the time. I walked the last few guests to their cars personally, thanking each one individually, aware even then of a strange undercurrent running beneath the day's obvious success. Something unresolved hovering just beyond what I could name concretely, connected somehow to Frank's discovery, Carol's story, and Tyler's abrupt disappearance minutes earlier without explanation. Zoe asked about it later that evening, and I gave her the simplest, gentlest version of the truth I could manage. Simone suggested we start cleanup properly now that most guests had left. Just a handful of stragglers remaining near the driveway comparing photos from the day on their phones. I agreed, though something kept pulling my attention back toward Debbie's house across the street. Dark windows, no visible movement, an unsettling stillness I couldn't quite shake off. Carol later said Harold would have hated seeing things unfold this way, and I believed her completely. Around 4:40, my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the garage side camera, the one covering the side entrance rarely used by anyone besides me. I checked it reflexively, expecting a stray cat or a neighbor's dog, and instead saw a figure moving carefully along the side fence, staying low, deliberately avoiding the main driveway entirely. Simone always said patience was its own kind of strength, and that spring tested every bit of mine. My chest tightened, immediately recognizing the visor, the same one Debbie wore to every single HOA meeting I'd ever attended, now bobbing along my side fence in broad daylight while a dozen remaining guests still lingered just around the corner, completely unaware anything unusual was unfolding mere feet from where they stood chatting. I kept my voice steady, though my hands, if anyone had looked closely, were not nearly as calm. I said nothing to Simone yet, not wanting to cause a scene with guests still present, and quietly pulled up the live feed on my phone, watching Debbie test the side gate latch carefully, glancing around twice before finding it unlocked, exactly as it always was during daytime hours when I moved freely between the garage and backyard. I've thought about that exact moment many times since, wondering how differently things might have gone without it. She slipped through the gate and moved directly toward the garage's side entrance, the one leading to my private workshop area where client vehicles and, more importantly, my entire filing box of HOA correspondence sat locked in a cabinet Frank and I had discussed just that morning during our conversation about the embezzlement discrepancies. Frank always said the smallest details told the truest story, and this was no exception to that rule. I texted Simone silently instead of speaking aloud. Just 3 words, "Debbie's in back," along with a screenshot from the camera feed. Simone's face changed instantly reading it, and she quietly excused herself from the remaining guests, walking calmly toward me instead of running, careful not to alert anyone else to what was unfolding. I remember the exact quality of light that afternoon, the kind that makes even hard days look deceptively peaceful. We both watched the live feed together for a moment. Debbie now testing the side entrance door handle, finding it locked, then pulling something small from her pocket. A set of keys I didn't recognize immediately until Simone whispered that it looked like the spare set the previous homeowner apparently never fully accounted for during our purchase years earlier. Whatever calm I projected outwardly, inside I was already bracing myself for whatever was coming next. I felt something shift from confusion into clarity watching her fit that key into the lock. This wasn't spontaneous. This required planning. Acquiring a key that shouldn't exist anymore. Choosing the exact hour when guests remained nearby as cover but attention had shifted toward cleanup. Timing engineered around a day she knew would leave me distracted. Frank's careful, methodical nature turned out to be exactly what this whole situation eventually needed most. Simone immediately called Detective Reyes's direct line. The card still sitting in our kitchen drawer exactly where I'd left it weeks earlier, explaining calmly that a woman was actively breaking into our garage using an unauthorized key while we watched live on security cameras. An active situation requiring immediate response rather than a delayed report. It wasn't dramatic in the moment, just one more thread quietly pulling tighter around everything else already unraveling. Reyes confirmed she was sending a unit immediately, given the department's flagged awareness of our documented harassment history, estimating arrival within 10 minutes depending on traffic near the neighborhood. I stayed rooted near the driveway, phone still recording the live feed, resisting every instinct telling me to run back there and confront Debbie directly myself. The neighborhood had a way of noticing everything eventually, even the things people worked hardest to keep hidden. Priya's advice echoed loudly in my memory at that exact moment. Document. Don't engage physically. Let evidence and authorities handle confrontation rather than emotion. I forwarded the live clip to Priya as well, adding a timestamp note, building the exact kind of ironclad record she'd been coaching me toward preparing for months without either of us quite knowing why yet. Tyler's face in that instant told me more than his words ever managed to explain about what was happening at home. The remaining guests, oblivious, continued chatting near the driveway entrance, completely unaware that 30 feet away, inside my own garage, the HOA president was currently attempting entry through a locked door using a key that legally had no business existing anymore, searching for something urgent enough to risk exactly this level of exposure. It was the kind of moment that felt ordinary while it was happening and enormous only in hindsight. I watched the feed show her finally get the door open, slipping inside quickly, and immediately move not toward my tools or the cars at all, but directly toward the file cabinet Frank and I had specifically discussed that very morning. The one containing every document I'd compiled proving her harassment pattern across 4 escalating months. That was the moment, looking back, when the whole situation stopped feeling manageable and started feeling inevitable. That confirmed something I hadn't wanted to fully accept until that exact second. Watching her hands work at the cabinet lock, this wasn't random spite or property value complaints anymore. This was someone actively trying to destroy evidence, likely aware, somehow, that Frank had started digging into financial records that morning that could expose something far bigger than bylaw disputes. Something about the stillness of the street that day made the whole moment feel larger than it should have. I texted Frank immediately. One line, "She's in my garage right now going for the file cabinet." His response came back within seconds. "Don't let her leave with anything. I'm 15 minutes out. Calling the full board right now." Pieces I hadn't fully connected were suddenly assembling themselves rapidly into a single, coherent, damning picture. It felt small enough to dismiss and important enough that I wrote it down in my folder anyway. Just in case. Simone squeezed my arm hard. Both of us watching the feed together in tense silence. Guests still chatting obliviously nearby, completely unaware they were standing feet away from what was quietly becoming the most consequential moment in months of accumulated harassment. Finally captured cleanly, undeniably, on camera with no room left for ambiguity or denial. Simone squeezed my hand without saying anything, and somehow that said everything either of us needed to hear. The cabinet lock held longer than Debbie apparently expected, her movements growing visibly more frantic on camera. Glancing toward the door repeatedly, clearly aware time was working against her now in a way her earlier, more patient campaigns of harassment had never required her to consider or worry about before this exact moment. Even now, I can picture the exact expression on her face, somewhere between defiance and something close to fear. I heard, faintly, the first distant siren approaching the neighborhood, still minutes out but unmistakably real, cutting through the ordinary afternoon sounds of guests packing up cars. And Zoe chattering happily with a lingering car club member about her stuffed dinosaur's supervisory duties throughout the entire successful, if now dramatically complicated, showcase day. Pam's silence in that moment spoke louder than anything she could have actually said out loud. Whatever Debbie had planned walking through that side gate minutes earlier, she clearly hadn't accounted for cameras, for Frank's financial discovery that same morning, for Tyler's nervous behavior, or for the simple fact that 30 feet away, her every move was being watched, recorded, and reported to exactly the people capable of ending this permanently. None of us said much about it right away, but the weight of it sat with me for days afterward. Debbie abandoned the locked cabinet suddenly, apparently deciding it wasn't worth the remaining time, and instead grabbed a heavy wrench off my workbench, swinging it hard against the cabinet's side panel, denting the metal badly enough that the lock mechanism finally gave way on the third strike. Sharp metallic clangs echoing through the garage. It was a small detail at the time, but I've never forgotten exactly how it felt in that moment. The noise carried further than she probably expected. One of the lingering car club members near the driveway glancing toward the garage curiously, asking aloud whether everything was okay back there. I told him quickly it was probably just something falling, buying time while Simone kept the live feed recording steadily on her phone. I didn't fully appreciate then how much that one detail would end up mattering months later in court. Debbie yanked open the damaged cabinet drawer and began pulling files out rapidly, scanning labels, clearly searching for something specific rather than simply destroying everything indiscriminately. She found my harassment documentation folder. The thick one Priya had helped me organize, and shoved it under her arm before turning toward the door to leave. I understood, even then, that whatever happened next would define how the rest of this played out entirely. That's when she noticed something on the workbench that made her freeze completely. A manila envelope Frank had actually left behind that morning by accident, containing printed copies of the Ashcroft Grounds Solutions invoices he'd been reviewing before heading home to finish his documentation, left there during our earlier hurried conversation about the discrepancies. It seems obvious in hindsight, but back then it just felt like one more strange piece of a puzzle. Debbie snatched that envelope too, hands visibly shaking now on camera, opening it right there in the garage and going pale, reading the printed invoice copies, confirming exactly what Frank had discovered hours earlier. Whatever calculation had brought her into my garage originally, this discovery clearly wasn't part of her plan at all. I kept turning it over in my mind long after the day itself had ended, unable to fully let it go. She stood frozen for several long seconds, envelope in one hand, my harassment folder in the other, visibly grasping the scale of what had actually been found that day. Not just evidence against me, but evidence that could dismantle everything about the life and authority she'd spent years carefully constructing in Magnolia Ridge. I didn't know it yet, but that detail would matter more than almost anything else that happened that whole month. The sirens grew louder outside, close enough now that even the guests near the driveway noticed, conversation stopping as several heads turned toward the street. I stepped forward finally, no longer willing to simply watch remotely, walking calmly but deliberately toward the garage's side gate where Debbie would have to exit. I told myself it was nothing, the same way I'd told myself that about a dozen smaller things before it. Simone grabbed my arm briefly, reminding me quietly of Priya's advice about not engaging physically, and I nodded, adjusting my approach, planning simply to stand near the gate, phone recording, blocking nothing physically but making absolutely certain she couldn't claim later that no one witnessed her leaving my property with stolen documents in hand. Priya later told me these were exactly the kinds of details juries remembered longest, small and human and telling. Debbie emerged from the side entrance moments later, folder and envelope clutched tightly, moving fast until she saw me standing near the gate. Phone raised, recording. She stopped short, expression cycling rapidly through several emotions. Shock, calculation, something close to panic finally breaking through the composed mask she'd maintained for months. Even Doug, usually easygoing about everything, admitted afterward that something about it had struck him as genuinely off. "This isn't what it looks like," she said immediately, voice higher than her usual controlled tone. The same phrase apparently universal to anyone caught somewhere they clearly shouldn't be, holding things clearly not their own. I said nothing, simply kept recording, letting her own words on camera do whatever work they needed to do. Looking back now, I can see how much that single afternoon was quietly shaping everything still to come. "I was just checking for code violations," she continued, gesturing vaguely with the stolen folder still tucked under her arm. An explanation that made even less sense, given she was holding my personal harassment documentation rather than anything resembling a building inspection form or official HOA compliance checklist of any kind. There was a particular kind of quiet that followed moments like that, one I was slowly learning to recognize. The first police cruiser turned onto Chestnut Loop as she spoke, lights flashing silently, drawing every remaining guest's attention completely now, phones coming out instinctively, among the small crowd still lingering near the driveway, several already recording the unfolding scene without anyone needing to ask them to start documenting anything. Some part of me already sensed we were building towards something neither of us was fully ready to face. Debbie's eyes widened seeing the cruiser, and for one brief moment I genuinely thought she might try running, glancing toward the side fence like calculating an escape route. Instead she seemed to deflate slightly, shoulders dropping, folder still clutched against her chest like something she couldn't quite make herself release even now. I remember thinking, even then, that this was the kind of thing you don't fully understand until much later. "Officer Martinez," Reyes's partner, stepped out first, immediately noting the folder and envelope in Debbie's hands, asking directly whether those belonged to her or to the property owner. Debbie hesitated just long enough that the silence itself answered the question more clearly than any verbal response could have managed at that point. I found myself replaying it that night, trying to decide whether I was overreacting or finally seeing clearly. I stepped forward then, calmly explaining the situation, the documented harassment history, the security footage showing her using an unauthorized key to enter through the side gate, breaking into the locked file cabinet with a wrench, and taking both my personal documentation and separate HOA financial records that weren't hers to remove either. Debbie's composure, I was starting to realize, had always been thinner than any of us originally assumed. Detective Reyes arrived moments later, immediately recognizing the situation from our prior conversations about the harassment pattern, requesting the security footage be preserved and asking Debbie directly to set down whatever she was holding. Debbie complied slowly, placing the folder and envelope on the driveway pavement like surrendering something precious against her will. It struck me later that Debbie had never once, in all those months, actually looked me in the eye. "You don't understand what's actually happening here," Debbie said, voice cracking now, addressing Reyes directly with something almost desperate underneath the words. "There are things in that envelope that aren't accurate. Mistakes. Misunderstandings that could ruin everything I've worked for if people see them out of context without proper explanation first." Reyes had a way of asking questions that made you realize how much you actually already knew without saying it. Reyes remained professionally calm, explaining that regardless of the envelope's contents, breaking and entering, property theft, and unauthorized entry using an illegally obtained key were separate legal matters entirely from whatever the documents themselves might or might not contain, matters that would need to be addressed through proper channels afterward. I've since learned that the quietest details are often the ones that end up mattering the very most. Frank arrived at that exact moment, having driven straight over the instant I'd texted him, stepping out of his car and immediately recognizing the envelope on the pavement as the exact documents he'd accidentally left in my garage that morning, confirming aloud for the officers that yes, those specific financial records belonged to the HOA, not to Debbie personally. Zoe, of course, noticed none of this, still young enough to see only cars and sunshine and a good afternoon. Debbie turned toward Frank with something close to betrayal in her expression, as though his simple confirmation of an obvious fact constituted some personal attack against her rather than basic honesty about ownership of documents she'd just stolen minutes earlier from a locked cabinet inside someone else's private garage. Simone would later say she felt the same unease, though neither of us spoke it aloud at the time. "You don't know the whole story either, Frank," she said, voice rising now, guests and neighbors gathering closer despite officers gently asking people to maintain distance. That landscaping company handled real work. There were expenses, receipts, things that got complicated after Harold died, and I couldn't manage the paperwork properly anymore for a while. Zoe asked about it later that evening, and I gave her the simplest, gentlest version of the truth I could manage. Frank, gently but firmly, pointed out that a while apparently meant nearly 2 years of consistent, escalating payments to a company registered at her own home address, work that multiple residents, including himself, had personally never once witnessed being performed anywhere on the actual HOA common areas during that entire documented period. Carol later said Harold would have hated seeing things unfold this way, and I believed her completely. Debbie's composure finally broke completely at that point, tears mixing with anger as she insisted repeatedly that she'd intended to return the money eventually, that Harold's medical bills before his death had left her desperate, that she'd never meant for it to continue this long once she'd started. Words tumbling out faster than she could seemingly control anymore. Simone always said patience was its own kind of strength, and that spring tested every bit of mine. Officer Martinez began the arrest process calmly, reading Debbie her rights while Reyes documented the scene, photographing the damaged file cabinet, the wrench still resting on my workbench, and the security footage timestamp confirming every detail of her entry, search, and attempted exit with stolen property clutched against her chest. I kept my voice steady, though my hands, if anyone had looked closely, were not nearly as calm. The remaining guests watched in stunned silence, several still recording on their phones. Zoe standing beside Simone with wide eyes, clearly processing something enormous happening in real time that she'd likely be asking questions about for weeks afterward. Questions I honestly wasn't sure yet how to fully answer myself. I've thought about that exact moment many times since, wondering how differently things might have gone without it. Tyler appeared at the edge of his own driveway during the arrest, having apparently heard the commotion from inside his house, watching his mother placed in handcuffs with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between shock and something that looked almost like relief finally settling after weeks of quiet, unexplained tension building at home. Frank always said the smallest details told the truest story, and this was no exception to that rule. Debbie called out to Tyler as officers guided her toward the cruiser. Something about calling his aunt, about not worrying, about this all being a misunderstanding that will get sorted out properly. Tyler didn't move from the driveway, didn't respond, just watched with an expression that suggested he'd already understood far more than she realized. I remember the exact quality of light that afternoon, the kind that makes even hard days look deceptively peaceful. I approached Officer Martinez once Debbie was secured in the cruiser, providing my full statement, the harassment file, timestamps, everything Priya and I had spent months compiling now finally serving its actual intended purpose. Reyes confirmed the security footage would be pulled formally as evidence, corroborating everything witnesses had just seen unfold live minutes earlier. Whatever calm I projected outwardly, inside I was already bracing myself for whatever was coming next. Frank stayed behind to speak privately with Officer Martinez about the financial discrepancies, providing his own documentation and offering to coordinate with the HOA's management company for a full formal audit covering the entire period Debbie had served as president, a process he estimated could take weeks given the apparent scale involved. Frank's careful, methodical nature turned out to be exactly what this whole situation eventually needed most. Carol, Harold's sister, still lingering near the GTO from earlier, approached quietly during the chaos, expression somewhere between sadness and vindication, mentioning softly that she'd always suspected something wasn't right with Debbie's finances after Harold passed, though she'd never had proof or reason enough to actually voice those suspicions aloud before today. It wasn't dramatic in the moment, just one more thread quietly pulling tighter around everything else already unraveling. Simone gathered Zoe close, explaining gently in simple terms that sometimes grown-ups make very bad choices when they're sad or scared, and that the police were there to make sure things got fixed properly. Careful phrasing that seemed to satisfy Zoe's immediate questions without overwhelming her with details she was too young to fully process yet. The neighborhood had a way of noticing everything eventually, even the things people worked hardest to keep hidden. The remaining car club members lingered longer than they probably intended, several approaching me afterward with quiet words of support. One older woman mentioning she'd dealt with a similarly controlling HOA years earlier and admired how calmly I'd handled something that could have easily turned violent or far more dangerous than it actually did. Tyler's face in that instant told me more than his words ever managed to explain about what was happening at home. Angela Cho's producer called within the hour, having heard about the arrest through a police scanner alert, asking whether I'd be willing to provide a follow-up statement given the news crew had already been on scene earlier that same day filming what was originally intended as a simple charity feature story. It was the kind of moment that felt ordinary while it was happening and enormous only in hindsight. I agreed cautiously, mostly wanting to ensure the scholarship fund and the kids it would help remained the actual focus, not sensationalized neighborhood drama. Though I understood realistically that the story would likely lead with Debbie's arrest regardless of how carefully I tried framing my own comments during any interview. That was the moment, looking back, when the whole situation stopped feeling manageable and started feeling inevitable. Priya called that evening once word reached her through the police report filing, confirming she'd represent me formally now regarding both the criminal case against Debbie and any potential civil action related to months of documented harassment. Mentioning the security footage alone would likely make this one of the more straightforward cases she'd handled in years. Something about the stillness of the street that day made the whole moment feel larger than it should have. Detective Reyes mentioned, almost as an aside while wrapping up her report at the scene, that Debbie's purse, searched incident to arrest per standard procedure, contained several documents, worth noting for the ongoing investigation, including what appeared to be printed copies of altered HOA meeting minutes dated months earlier, never previously provided to residents. It felt small enough to dismiss and important enough that I wrote it down in my folder anyway, just in case. Those altered minutes, Reyes explained, showed language regarding the commercial activity bylaw significantly different from what Frank remembered actually being discussed and voted on during the meeting itself, suggesting Debbie had been maintaining two separate versions of official records for reasons the investigation would need to fully untangle later. Simone squeezed my hand without saying anything, and somehow that said everything either of us needed to hear. Frank confirmed immediately that the version in Debbie's purse matched nothing he recalled voting on, meaning she'd potentially been operating under fabricated authority for the bylaw. Restrictions targeting my garage the entire time. A detail that, combined with the embezzlement evidence, painted a picture far more calculated than simple neighborhood pettiness. Even now, I can picture the exact expression on her face, somewhere between defiance and something close to fear. I felt something complicated settle over me hearing all of this. Not quite triumph. Something closer to exhausted relief mixed with genuine sadness for Tyler, who'd clearly been living inside a household far more troubled than any of us outside it had fully understood until circumstances forced everything into the open at once. Pam's silence in that moment spoke louder than anything she could have actually said out loud. Simone found me standing near the garage after most of the guests had finally left. Cruiser long gone. Frank heading home to begin the formal audit process. Tyler still standing quietly on his own driveway, apparently waiting for Carol to arrive and help him figure out what happened next for him personally. None of us said much about it right away, but the weight of it sat with me for days afterward. I walked over to Tyler eventually, unsure exactly what to say to a 17-year-old whose mother had just been arrested outside his own house on live camera in front of half the neighborhood. He spoke first, quietly, saying he'd known something was wrong for months, but hadn't understood how deep it actually went until today. It was a small detail at the time, but I've never forgotten exactly how it felt in that moment. Carol arrived shortly after, embracing Tyler tightly, promising he wouldn't be navigating whatever came next entirely alone, mentioning she'd already called a family attorney separate from whatever criminal defense Debbie would eventually need for her own case moving forward through the legal system in the coming weeks and months ahead. I didn't fully appreciate then how much that one detail would end up mattering months later in court. I offered quietly that Tyler was welcome in my garage anytime he needed somewhere familiar to think, an offer that seemed to genuinely surprise him given everything his mother had put my family through for months, though he nodded, saying he'd probably take me up on that sooner rather than later given everything unfolding at home now. I understood, even then, that whatever happened next would define how the rest of this played out entirely. That night, after Zoe finally fell asleep exhausted from the longest, strangest day of her young life, Simone and I sat on the porch reviewing everything that had happened. The showcase's genuine success now permanently intertwined with an arrest neither of us could have predicted even hours before it actually occurred right in front of us. It seems obvious in hindsight, but back then it just felt like one more strange piece of a puzzle. News of the arrest spread through Magnolia Ridge faster than anything Debbie herself had ever managed to spread about my garage. Neighbors texting each other constantly, several stopping by over the following days to offer support once word confirmed everything openly rather than through secondhand rumor filtered through Pam's usual gossip network. I kept turning it over in my mind long after the day itself had ended, unable to fully let it go. Pam herself called Simone directly 2 days later, tearful, admitting she'd genuinely believed Debbie's version of events for months, backing up complaints she now realized had been fabricated entirely, apologizing for the coldness she'd shown at the mailbox during those tense weeks leading up to the showcase itself. I didn't know it yet, but that detail would matter more than almost anything else that happened that whole month. Debbie posted bail within 48 hours. Released pending trial with conditions including no contact with me or my family. A restraining order Priya had specifically requested given the documented harassment history combined now with an active breaking and entering charge still fresh on the county docket. I told myself it was nothing, the same way I told myself that about a dozen smaller things before it. Frank called with updates almost daily as the formal audit progressed. The embezzlement total climbing steadily beyond initial estimates, eventually reaching nearly $60,000 once auditors traced additional shell payments through 2 other fake vendor names Debbie had apparently used interchangeably over the years to avoid detection. Priya later told me these were exactly the kinds of details juries remembered longest. Small and human and telling. The management company suspended Debbie's board access immediately, though technically she remained HOA president until a formal removal vote could be scheduled. An awkward legal limbo that left residents furious knowing someone facing serious criminal charges still technically held nominal authority over community decisions during the interim period. Even Doug, usually easygoing about everything, admitted afterward that something about it had struck him as genuinely off. An emergency general meeting got scheduled within 2 weeks. Every resident notified properly this time. No shortcuts. No unilateral scheduling by a single officer acting alone. Frank personally overseeing the notice process to ensure nothing about this vote could later be challenged on procedural grounds the way Debbie's own actions so often had been. Looking back now, I can see how much that single afternoon was quietly shaping everything still to come. I received a subpoena to testify at that meeting regarding the harassment pattern and the break-in itself. Something Priya had anticipated and prepared me thoroughly for. Reviewing my documentation folder together line by line to ensure every date, every incident, every piece of evidence would hold up under any scrutiny. There was a particular kind of quiet that followed moments like that, one I was slowly learning to recognize. Angela Cho's follow-up story aired that week, focusing heavily on the embezzlement discovery alongside the break-in, interviewing Frank about the audit findings and briefly showing security footage the police had released as part of the public record. Footage that made the entire sequence of events undeniable to anyone watching. Some part of me already sensed we were building towards something neither of us was fully ready to face. Debbie, through her defense attorney, issued a brief statement calling the situation a deeply personal matter being unfairly sensationalized, language that struck most neighbors as tone-deaf given the mounting financial evidence and the clear footage showing her breaking a lock with a wrench inside someone else's private garage. I remember thinking, even then, that this was the kind of thing you don't fully understand until much later. Carol reached out again during this period, mentioning she'd been in contact with Tyler regularly, helping him navigate school and daily life while Debbie dealt with legal proceedings, and that Tyler had started spending afternoons at my garage almost daily now. Something Carol said seemed to be genuinely helping him process everything happening at home. I found myself replaying it that night, trying to decide whether I was overreacting or finally seeing clearly. Tyler mentioned during one visit that he'd found additional paperwork in his mother's home office while helping Carol organize things. Old bank statements showing the Ashcroft Grounds Solutions account, dated back further than even Frank's audit had initially traced, suggesting the embezzlement scheme predated Harold's death by several months rather than starting afterward as Debbie had claimed. Debbie's composure, I was starting to realize, had always been thinner than any of us originally assumed. That detail, once verified by Frank and forwarded through Priya to the prosecutor's office, complicated Debbie's grief-driven explanation considerably, suggesting financial motive had existed independently before Harold's passing rather than emerging purely from widow's desperation. A distinction that mattered significantly for how prosecutors would eventually approach sentencing recommendations. It struck me later that Debbie had never once, in all those months, actually looked me in the eye. The community management company launched its own internal review simultaneously, examining whether their oversight failures had enabled Debbie's unchecked authority over financial approvals for years. A review that resulted in new mandatory dual signature requirements for any HOA vendor payment exceeding a modest threshold going forward. Reyes had a way of asking questions that made you realize how much you actually already knew without saying it. I spent one afternoon walking Zoe through simplified explanations again, careful with her age but honest enough that she understood people sometimes did wrong things, and that consequences existed for a reason, using the scholarship fund itself as a counterexample of what happens when a community works together honestly instead. I've since learned that the quietest details are often the ones that end up mattering the very most. Simone noticed the neighborhood's general mood shifting noticeably that month. More open conversation at the mailbox. Neighbors who'd previously avoided controversial topics now openly discussing HOA governance and accountability, several volunteering interest in joining the board themselves once a vacancy inevitably opened following Debbie's removal. Zoe, of course, noticed none of this, still young enough to see only cars and sunshine and a good afternoon. Doug officially bought a classic Bronco that month, bringing it by for advice on where to start restoration work, joking that watching my garage survive an actual attempted robbery by the HOA president herself had somehow convinced him this was exactly the neighborhood he wanted to keep investing in long-term. Simone would later say she felt the same unease, though neither of us spoke it aloud at the time. Frank asked if I'd consider joining the board myself once Debbie's seat opened officially, an idea I hadn't previously considered given months of adversarial history with the position itself. I told him I'd think about it seriously, recognizing that positive change sometimes required people willing to actually show up rather than simply avoiding institutions after bad experiences. Zoe asked about it later that evening, and I gave her the simplest, gentlest version of the truth I could manage. Priya prepared me thoroughly for the upcoming general meeting testimony, walking through likely questions from residents, from Debbie's remaining defenders, if any still existed at that point, and from the county's civil investigator examining potential HOA liability for allowing months of documented harassment to continue unchecked before finally escalating. Carol later said Harold would have hated seeing things unfold this way, and I believed her completely. Tyler asked me directly one afternoon whether I hated his mother, a question that clearly weighed on him heavily given everything he'd witnessed and learned recently. I told him honestly that I didn't hate her, that I was angry about what she'd done, but that anger and hatred weren't quite the same thing, and that he wasn't responsible for her choices regardless. Simone always said patience was its own kind of strength, and that spring tested every bit of mine. That conversation seemed to genuinely help him, something shifting visibly in how he carried himself afterward, less guarded, more willing to talk openly about missing the version of his mother that existed before whatever pressures or grief had pushed her toward the choices that eventually cost her everything she'd built in Magnolia Ridge. I kept my voice steady, though my hands, if anyone had looked closely, were not nearly as calm. The prosecutor's office confirmed formal charges within 3 weeks: breaking and entering, theft, and felony embezzlement. The combined weight of evidence, financial documentation, security footage, and witness testimony making the case, according to Priya's assessment, one of the more thoroughly documented she'd encountered in years of HOA-adjacent litigation work. I've thought about that exact moment many times since, wondering how differently things might have gone without it. Debbie's attorney reportedly began exploring plea negotiations almost immediately given the overwhelming evidence, a detail Priya shared cautiously, noting that a plea deal, while less dramatic than a public trial, would likely still require restitution and formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing that residents deserved regardless of courtroom theatrics. Frank always said the smallest details told the truest story, and this was no exception to that rule. Simone and I discussed whether to attend any court proceedings personally, ultimately deciding I'd testify if required but otherwise focus energy on the business and the family, rather than following every legal development obsessively, a boundary that felt healthier than letting Debbie continue occupying disproportionate space in our daily lives even now. I remember the exact quality of light that afternoon, the kind that makes even hard days look deceptively peaceful. The general meeting date arrived finally. The largest turnout in HOA history, according to Frank. Nearly every household represented. Folding chairs added to accommodate overflow crowds spilling into the clubhouse hallway. Everyone waiting to hear the formal presentation of findings before the removal vote itself took place. Whatever calm I projected outwardly, inside I was already bracing myself for whatever was coming next. Frank presented the financial audit methodically. Numbers on a projector screen. The shell company payments. The altered meeting minutes. Everything laid out without embellishment. Letting documented facts speak clearly rather than relying on emotional appeals that Debbie herself had used so often during her years running these exact meetings. Frank's careful, methodical nature turned out to be exactly what this whole situation eventually needed most. I testified next, walking through the harassment timeline calmly, supported by Priya's careful preparation. Presenting my documentation folder as exhibits, the spreadsheet comparing selective enforcement, the anonymous complaint patterns, and finally the security footage from showcase day, playing the actual break-in for the assembled residents to witness directly themselves. It wasn't dramatic in the moment, just one more thread quietly pulling tighter around everything else already unraveling. The room went completely silent watching that footage. Debbie testing the gate, entering through the stolen key, swinging the wrench against my cabinet, searching frantically through files before being confronted at the exit. Several residents, including some who'd previously sided with Debbie during earlier disputes, visibly reacted with genuine shock. The neighborhood had a way of noticing everything eventually, even the things people worked hardest to keep hidden. Pam spoke during public comment, tearful again, publicly apologizing to Simone and me for supporting complaints she now understood had been fabricated, acknowledging she'd let personal friendship cloud judgment about behavior that, viewed honestly, had clearly crossed serious lines months before the actual break-in ever occurred that final day. Tyler's face in that instant told me more than his words ever managed to explain about what was happening at home. Carol attended too, speaking briefly about Harold, about grief, about wanting residents to understand there was human complexity behind the crimes without excusing them. A nuanced perspective that seemed to help the room process everything with slightly less raw anger and slightly more somber, complicated understanding of what had actually happened. It was the kind of moment that felt ordinary while it was happening and enormous only in hindsight. The removal vote itself passed unanimously. Every single hand raised without hesitation, formally ending Debbie's HOA presidency effective immediately, Frank stepping in as interim president until a proper election could be scheduled, the community finally closing one chapter while criminal proceedings continued separately through the county court system. That was the moment, looking back, when the whole situation stopped feeling manageable and started feeling inevitable. I thought the general meeting marked the end of the hardest part. But Priya warned me criminal proceedings often produced their own unexpected turns, especially once a defendant realized a plea deal meant fully admitting guilt on record rather than continuing to control the narrative the way Debbie had managed for years beforehand. Something about the stillness of the street that day made the whole moment feel larger than it should have. Sure enough, 3 weeks before her scheduled plea hearing, Debbie abruptly changed attorneys, hiring someone more aggressive who announced intentions to fight the charges at trial instead. A strategy shift that stunned Priya given the overwhelming video evidence already sitting in the prosecutor's file against her. It felt small enough to dismiss and important enough that I wrote it down in my folder anyway, just in case. The new defense strategy, once revealed through discovery, centered on an audacious claim that I had somehow orchestrated the entire break-in myself, luring Debbie into the garage under false pretenses and staging the security footage specifically to destroy her reputation before the showcase's news coverage could expose my own supposed code violations first. Simone squeezed my hand without saying anything, and somehow that said everything either of us needed to hear. Priya laughed out loud reading the filing. Though the laughter faded quickly once she confirmed Debbie's attorney genuinely intended presenting this theory at trial, requiring us to prepare extensive rebuttal evidence proving the footage's authenticity through the security company's original unedited cloud recordings, time-stamped and unaltered from the moment of capture. Even now, I can picture the exact expression on her face, somewhere between defiance and something close to fear. Frank received his own subpoena to testify about the financial audit, and Tyler, devastatingly, got listed as a potential witness for his mother's defense, a development that visibly shook him when Carol explained what it meant. Being asked possibly to testify supporting a version of events he knew personally wasn't true. Pam's silence in that moment spoke louder than anything she could have actually said out loud. Tyler came to my garage that evening, distraught, saying he couldn't lie for his mother even if her attorney pressured him to shade his testimony favorably. But that testifying against her publicly felt like a betrayal he wasn't sure he could survive emotionally regardless of how clearly he understood right from wrong in this situation. None of us said much about it right away, but the weight of it sat with me for days afterward. I told Tyler honestly that no attorney could force him to lie under oath, that Priya could help connect him with his own separate legal counsel if needed, someone representing only his interests rather than his mother's defense strategy, and that choosing truth over loyalty to a parent's wrongdoing wasn't betrayal. It was integrity. It was a small detail at the time, but I've never forgotten exactly how it felt in that moment. Carol arranged separate counsel for Tyler within days, a young attorney who specialized in minors caught in family legal disputes, someone who helped Tyler understand. He could simply answer truthfully whatever he was asked without needing to actively volunteer testimony against his mother beyond what direct, honest answers required. I didn't fully appreciate then how much that one detail would end up mattering months later in court. The trial date approached with mounting local attention. Angela chose station now covering it as an ongoing story. The strange combination of HOA drama, embezzlement, and an audacious defense theory generating exactly the kind of sensational coverage I'd originally hoped to avoid entirely when planning a simple charity car showcase months earlier. I understood, even then, that whatever happened next would define how the rest of this played out entirely. Jury selection took 2 full days. Priya sitting beside me throughout since I remained the prosecution's central witness, watching potential jurors get questioned about HOA experiences, video evidence skepticism, and general attitudes toward small claims involving neighborhood disputes escalating into criminal territory the way this case unmistakably had. It seems obvious in hindsight, but back then it just felt like one more strange piece of a puzzle. Opening statements framed the case starkly different depending on which attorney spoke. The prosecutor presenting a methodical timeline of harassment, forged documents, embezzlement, and a break-in captured clearly on camera, while Debbie's new attorney insisted the footage had been manipulated and that his client was actually the true victim of a calculated setup. I kept turning it over in my mind long after the day itself had ended, unable to fully let it go. The security company's technical expert testified first regarding footage authenticity, walking the jury through cloud storage timestamps, metadata verification, and the impossibility of the specific alterations Debbie's attorney claimed had occurred. Testimony that visibly deflated the defense's core argument before the trial had even reached its second full day. I didn't know it yet, but that detail would matter more than almost anything else that happened that whole month. Frank testified next about the financial audit, methodical and unshaken under aggressive cross-examination, presenting bank records, shell company registrations, and altered meeting minutes with the same careful precision that had made him invaluable throughout the entire ordeal, refusing to be rattled by insinuations about personal bias against Debbie. I told myself it was nothing, the same way I told myself that about a dozen smaller things before it. I testified on the third day, walking the jury through months of documented harassment, the selective code enforcement, the anonymous complaints, the attempted lien, and finally the showcase day itself, staying factual and calm exactly as Priya had coached, letting the accumulated weight of evidence carry emotional impact without needing theatrics. Priya later told me these were exactly the kinds of details juries remembered longest, small and human and telling. Debbie's attorney cross-examined aggressively, suggesting I'd somehow anticipated the break-in and set elaborate traps, a theory that collapsed almost immediately once I calmly explained the cameras existed for months beforehand specifically because of documented prior harassment, installed with police knowledge well before the showcase date was even finalized. Even Doug, usually easygoing about everything, admitted afterward that something about it had struck him as genuinely off. Carol testified reluctantly about Harold, about the Mustang, providing context the prosecution used carefully to establish financial motive predating his death rather than emerging purely from grief. Testimony that clearly pained her personally even as she recognized its necessity for establishing the truth the jury deserved to hear. Looking back now, I can see how much that single afternoon was quietly shaping everything still to come. Tyler took the stand on the fourth day, visibly nervous but composed, answering the prosecutor's careful questions honestly about finding the folder his mother asked him to hide, about her unusual anxiety the morning of the showcase, and about statements he'd personally overheard that contradicted her defense's central conspiracy theory entirely. There was a particular kind of quiet that followed moments like that, one I was slowly learning to recognize. Debbie's attorney barely cross-examined Tyler at all, apparently recognizing that aggressively pressing a teenage witness testifying reluctantly against his own mother would likely alienate the jury further rather than helping his client's case in any meaningful way at this critical point in the proceedings. Some part of me already sensed we were building towards something neither of us was fully ready to face. Debbie herself took the stand on day 5, her new strategy requiring her personal testimony to support the elaborate setup theory, and under the prosecutor's methodical cross-examination, her story began fracturing visibly, dates not matching, explanations for the key's origin shifting between different accounts given at various points. I remember thinking, even then, that this was the kind of thing you don't fully understand until much later. The prosecutor produced the altered meeting minutes found in her purse during arrest, asking her directly to explain the discrepancy between that version and Frank's contemporaneous notes from the actual meeting itself. Debbie's answer grew increasingly tangled, claiming memory issues, then clerical error, then finally falling into uncomfortable silence. I found myself replaying it that night, trying to decide whether I was overreacting or finally seeing clearly. That silence, stretching several long seconds in a completely quiet courtroom, seemed to crystallize something for the jury that months of documents and footage had been building toward steadily. The visible moment where a carefully constructed narrative simply had nowhere left to go under direct, unavoidable scrutiny. Debbie's composure, I was starting to realize, had always been thinner than any of us originally assumed. The prosecutor then introduced financial records showing the embezzlement scheme's timeline predating Harold's death by nearly 4 months, directly contradicting Debbie's own testimony. Moments earlier claiming the scheme began purely from grief-driven desperation after losing her husband, a contradiction her own attorney seemed unable to adequately address afterward. It struck me later that Debbie had never once, in all those months, actually looked me in the eye. Debbie's composure finally cracked completely on the stand. Tears again, though this time without the earlier softness, something closer to raw frustration at having her carefully maintained version of events dismantled piece by piece in front of the exact community she'd spent years positioning herself as protecting and governing responsibly. Reyes had a way of asking questions that made you realize how much you actually already knew without saying it. Closing arguments followed the next morning, the prosecutor methodically summarizing the evidence timeline while Debbie's attorney pivoted unexpectedly toward asking for jury leniency, based on grief and personal tragedy rather than continuing to insist on innocence, a tacit acknowledgement that the setup theory had essentially collapsed entirely under trial scrutiny. I've since learned that the quietest details are often the ones that end up mattering the very most. The jury deliberated for just under 4 hours, a relatively short window given the complexity of charges involved, returning with guilty verdicts on all counts: breaking and entering, theft, and felony embezzlement. The courtroom absorbing the announcement with a kind of exhausted, quiet relief rather than dramatic celebration. Zoe, of course, noticed none of this, still young enough to see only cars and sunshine and a good afternoon. I felt something complicated hearing the verdict. Not triumph exactly, more like a long exhale after holding tension in my shoulders for months without fully realizing how heavy it had become. Watching Simone squeeze my hand tightly beside me while Tyler, sitting several rows back with Carol, simply closed his eyes briefly. Simone would later say she felt the same unease, though neither of us spoke it aloud at the time. Debbie remained composed hearing the verdict. Oddly, the fight seemingly gone from her entirely now that the outcome was finally settled beyond further argument. No more appeals to make, no more narratives left to construct. Just the plain fact of consequences arriving after months of trying every possible way to avoid them. Zoe asked about it later that evening, and I gave her the simplest, gentlest version of the truth I could manage. Sentencing got scheduled for 6 weeks later, allowing time for a pre-sentence investigation report, victim impact statements, and restitution calculations covering both the embezzled HOA funds and, per Priya's civil filing, damages related to months of documented harassment that had affected my business, my family, and our standing within the community. Carol later said Harold would have hated seeing things unfold this way, and I believed her completely. During those 6 weeks, the HOA formally elected new leadership, Frank remaining as president by unanimous resident vote, implementing transparency reforms including public financial reporting, dual signature requirements for vendor payments, and a formal grievance process ensuring no future resident could face months of unchecked, individually targeted harassment ever again. Simone always said patience was its own kind of strength, and that spring tested every bit of mine. I agreed to join the board myself that election cycle, motivated less by any desire for authority and more by genuine belief that institutions worked better with people willing to actually participate rather than simply avoiding them after difficult personal experiences. A decision Simone supported fully once we discussed the time commitment honestly. I kept my voice steady, though my hands, if anyone had looked closely, were not nearly as calm. Tyler moved in permanently with Carol during this period, an arrangement that seemed to genuinely stabilize him, finishing his final year of high school with plans. He mentioned excitedly one afternoon in my garage to enroll in the automotive technology program at the community college once he graduated that spring. I've thought about that exact moment many times since, wondering how differently things might have gone without it. Reed Restorations, meanwhile, saw a significant uptick in business following the local coverage. People from across the county reaching out for restoration work. Several specifically mentioning they wanted to support the mechanic who stood up to that HOA president. An unexpected silver lining neither Simone nor I had anticipated during the hardest months. Frank always said the smallest details told the truest story, and this was no exception to that rule. The scholarship fund, boosted further by donations following the news coverage, ended up funding 3 full automotive program scholarships that year instead of the single award originally planned. The shop teacher calling personally to share how transformative the additional funding would prove for students who couldn't otherwise afford program equipment costs. I remember the exact quality of light that afternoon, the kind that makes even hard days look deceptively peaceful. Angela Cho's final piece on the story aired the week before sentencing, framing it thoughtfully as a cautionary tale about unchecked authority in small community governance structures, careful to note Tyler's resilience and the positive outcomes that emerged for the neighborhood despite the painful circumstances that had produced them. Whatever calm I projected outwardly, inside I was already bracing myself for whatever was coming next. Pam Wickers, in a small but meaningful gesture, personally organized a neighborhood welcome basket for a new family moving into Debbie's former house once it eventually sold. A quiet act of community repair that Simone mentioned felt like Magnolia Ridge genuinely trying to heal rather than simply moving past what happened. Frank's careful, methodical nature turned out to be exactly what this whole situation eventually needed most. As sentencing day approached, I found myself thinking less about anger toward Debbie specifically and more about everything the entire ordeal had actually revealed. About community, about the difference between authority and integrity, and about how quickly good people could enable harm simply by staying quiet when something felt obviously wrong. It wasn't dramatic in the moment, just one more thread quietly pulling tighter around everything else already unraveling. Sentencing day arrived with the courtroom fuller than even the trial had drawn. Residents wanting to witness the case's formal conclusion after months of following every development through news coverage, board meetings, and neighborhood conversation that had touched nearly every household in Magnolia Ridge by that point. The neighborhood had a way of noticing everything eventually, even the things people worked hardest to keep hidden. The prosecutor requested a sentence reflecting both the financial scale of the embezzlement and the sustained, calculated nature of the harassment campaign, noting that unlike impulsive crimes, this case involved deliberate planning across many months, multiple fabricated documents, and a break-in requiring premeditated key acquisition well in advance. Tyler's face in that instant told me more than his words ever managed to explain about what was happening at home. Priya presented the victim impact statement on my family's behalf, detailing the business stress, the strain on Simone, the difficult conversations we'd had to navigate with Zoe, and the broader chilling effect the harassment had created for other residents afraid to speak up against Debbie's authority during her years as president. It was the kind of moment that felt ordinary while it was happening and enormous only in hindsight. Carol spoke too, carefully, acknowledging Debbie's genuine grief following Harold's death, while firmly stating that grief never justified the specific choices made afterward. A nuanced statement that seemed to resonate with the judge's eventual reasoning more than a purely emotional appeal from either side might have accomplished alone. That was the moment, looking back, when the whole situation stopped feeling manageable and started feeling inevitable. Debbie was given the opportunity to address the court directly before sentencing. And for the first time in the entire ordeal, she offered something resembling genuine, unguarded acknowledgement, admitting the harassment campaign had been deliberate, admitting the embezzlement had continued far longer than desperation could reasonably explain or excuse. Something about the stillness of the street that day made the whole moment feel larger than it should have. She specifically apologized to Tyler in that moment, voice breaking in a way that felt different from her earlier courtroom tears, acknowledging she'd let her own unresolved grief and need for control damage the one relationship that had mattered more than any HOA position or any grudge against a neighbor's success. It felt small enough to dismiss and important enough that I wrote it down in my folder anyway, just in case. The judge, weighing the pre-sentence report, the trial testimony, and the statements offered, sentenced Debbie to 18 months in county custody followed by 5 years probation, along with full restitution covering both the embezzled HOA funds and the civil damages related to the sustained harassment campaign against my family. Simone squeezed my hand without saying anything, and somehow that said everything either of us needed to hear. The restitution total came to just over $90,000 once combined, a sum Priya confirmed would be collected through a structured payment plan given Debbie's limited assets following legal fees, though the symbolic weight of the number mattered as much to residents as the actual dollar figure being recovered eventually. Even now, I can picture the exact expression on her face, somewhere between defiance and something close to fear. Debbie was led out of the courtroom that afternoon without the composed authority she'd carried into every HOA meeting for 6 years. Just a woman finally facing consequences. That months of forged documents, manipulated narratives, and desperate late afternoon break-ins had ultimately proven impossible to avoid or outmaneuver any longer. Pam's silence in that moment spoke louder than anything she could have actually said out loud. Tyler didn't attend sentencing, choosing instead to stay with Carol at home, a decision everyone respected completely, understanding that watching a parent sentenced to actual custody time carried a different emotional weight than following the case through news coverage or courtroom testimony from a protected distance. None of us said much about it right away, but the weight of it sat with me for days afterward. I drove home that afternoon feeling the strange, hollow quiet that follows something finally, completely ending. Not celebration exactly, more like setting down a weight I'd been carrying so long I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to walk without it pressing constantly against my shoulders every single day. It was a small detail at the time, but I've never forgotten exactly how it felt in that moment. Simone met me in the driveway, Zoe running out behind her asking immediately whether the HOA ladies' case was finally over, A question I answered honestly and simply, telling her yes, it was over, and that sometimes doing the right thing patiently and carefully really did work out eventually, even when it took a long time. I didn't fully appreciate then how much that one detail would end up mattering months later in court. Frank called that evening, mentioning the board's next meeting agenda would finally focus purely on ordinary community business. Landscaping bids, pool schedules, nothing involving lawsuits or criminal proceedings. A mundane normalcy that felt, after everything, like its own small, genuine victory worth appreciating fully. I understood, even then, that whatever happened next would define how the rest of this played out entirely. Doug stopped by that weekend with his Bronco project, asking technical questions, mentioning he'd heard about the sentencing from 3 separate neighbors before. I'd even had a chance to tell him myself, a small reminder that Magnolia Ridge, whatever its flaws, remained a community that noticed and cared about its own. It seems obvious in hindsight, but back then it just felt like one more strange piece of a puzzle. Carol brought Tyler by that same weekend, both looking lighter than I'd seen them look in months. Tyler asking whether the community college's automotive program required any specific tools beforehand, already planning practically for a future that finally felt genuinely his own rather than defined entirely by his mother's unraveling. I kept turning it over in my mind long after the day itself had ended, unable to fully let it go. Angela Cho's station ran a final short segment following sentencing, focused entirely on the scholarship fund's continued impact, interviewing 2 students now enrolled in the automotive program directly because of the showcase's original charitable purpose. A story ending exactly where I'd always hoped the whole thing would eventually land. I didn't know it yet, but that detail would matter more than almost anything else that happened that whole month. The HOA board meeting that followed operated with a transparency and calm efficiency I hadn't witnessed once during Debbie's entire tenure. Motions discussed openly, votes recorded properly, residents speaking without the underlying anxiety that had colored every gathering during the months her authority had gone functionally unchecked. I told myself it was nothing, the same way I told myself that about a dozen smaller things before it. I found myself, 6 months later, mentoring Tyler informally in the garage most weekends, watching him develop real skill with engines, occasionally catching glimpses of the same careful curiosity that had first drawn him toward my driveway back before either of us understood how completely our family's stories would eventually intertwine. Priya later told me these were exactly the kinds of details juries remembered longest, small and human and telling. Simone mentioned one evening that the whole ordeal, painful as it had been, had somehow left our little corner of Magnolia Ridge stronger than before. Neighbors who'd previously kept to themselves now checking in regularly. A genuine community having formed partly in response to surviving something difficult together. Even Doug, usually easygoing about everything, admitted afterward that something about it had struck him as genuinely off. Zoe, now approaching 9, still greeted Big Red the Camaro every evening before bed, though her dinosaur facts had recently expanded to include increasingly confident opinions about torque specifications, something that made both Simone and me laugh regularly at how thoroughly our daughter had absorbed her father's world. Looking back now, I can see how much that single afternoon was quietly shaping everything still to come. Reed Restorations expanded that year, hiring my first part-time assistant, a decision that would have seemed impossible during the darkest months of Debbie's harassment campaign, when simply keeping the garage open at all had felt like a daily struggle against forces determined to shut it down entirely. There was a particular kind of quiet that followed moments like that, one I was slowly learning to recognize. Frank, still serving as HOA president, called occasionally just to share good news, rising community satisfaction surveys, growing interest in board volunteer positions, a neighborhood association finally functioning the way it was always supposed to, serving residents rather than serving whoever happened to hold the most unchecked authority at any given moment. Some part of me already sensed we were building towards something neither of us was fully ready to face. I thought often, during quiet evenings in the garage, about how close everything had come to going differently, about Priya's early advice to simply document everything patiently, about Detective Reyes's willingness to take documented harassment seriously before it escalated further, about how much worse things might have become without those careful preparations. I remember thinking, even then, that this was the kind of thing you don't fully understand until much later. The second annual car showcase, scheduled that spring, drew nearly double the previous year's attendance. Tyler helping organize registration alongside Zoe, both kids proudly wearing matching Future Mechanics Fund shirts. The scholarship table doubling its fundraising total while cars filled not just my driveway but half the surrounding street peacefully. I found myself replaying it that night, trying to decide whether I was overreacting or finally seeing clearly. Debbie's letters occasionally arrived from county custody, addressed to Tyler mostly, sometimes to me directly, careful and measured now in ways her earlier communications never once managed to be, acknowledging specific wrongs plainly instead of hiding behind bylaws or vague accusations the way she always had before everything finally collapsed. Debbie's composure, I was starting to realize, had always been thinner than any of us originally assumed. I read one of those letters aloud to Simone one evening, surprised by its honesty. Debbie writing that she'd spent years mistaking control for competence and authority for respect. Lessons she said arrived far too late to undo the damage, but that she hoped, eventually, might still mean something to the people she'd hurt. It struck me later that Debbie had never once, in all those months, actually looked me in the eye. Tyler visited his mother monthly with Carol's support. Relationships slowly, carefully rebuilding on entirely different terms than before. Honest conversations, replacing the secrecy and anxiety that had defined his childhood home for years without him even having language yet to fully name what he'd been living through. Reyes had a way of asking questions that made you realize how much you actually already knew without saying it. Pam Wickers eventually joined the HOA's new grievance committee. Determined, she told Simone, to make sure no future resident ever felt as isolated and unheard as I had during those difficult months. A genuine effort at redemption that the neighborhood, gradually, allowed her the space to actually earn back. I've since learned that the quietest details are often the ones that end up mattering the very most. Magnolia Ridge settled into something calmer and more genuinely communal than it had ever been under Debbie's tenure. Disagreements still arising occasionally as they do in any neighborhood, but resolved now through actual process and conversation rather than fabricated complaints and unchecked personal vendettas hiding behind official letterhead. It was, finally, the kind of quiet the neighborhood had always deserved. Reed restorations thrived steadily in the years that followed, the scholarship fund growing into a permanent community fixture, and somewhere in that quiet, hard-won stability, I finally stopped checking the security cameras out of anxious habit and started simply enjoying the ordinary, unremarkable peace of watching my daughter grow up safely. Simone said she noticed the change in me before I did. People still ask sometimes what finally beat a woman who'd spent 6 years running Magnolia Ridge like her own private kingdom. And the honest answer is nothing dramatic. Just patience, documentation, community, and the simple refusal to disappear quietly just because someone with a little borrowed authority demanded that I should. Zoe asked about it later that evening, and I gave her the simplest, gentlest version of the truth I could manage. Debbie Ashcroft broke into my garage during the best day my family had built in years, and 30 minutes later she left it in handcuffs instead, taking with her every remaining shred of the control she'd spent so long convincing herself she was entitled to hold over people who'd simply wanted to live in peace. Carol later said Harold would have hated seeing things unfold this way, and I believed her completely. Some neighborhoods need a villain to remember what community actually means, and mine finally learned that lesson the hard way. Together, one honest conversation and one stubborn folder of evidence at a time.